Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It is indeed gratifying for me to be here with you at this very great institute, the Swedish Institute of Economics, and to take part in this very important discussion on development issues, with particular emphasis on the current status of affairs in Somalia. I want to thank the dedicated organizers who made this meeting possible, especially Professor Anders and his team, to recognize the presence of the Swedish ambassador to Somalia, Mr. Stephen Tillander, who is seated next to me. Thank you very much for coming, Ambassador. This is a very huge subject, and it cannot be covered in one session. Indeed, speaking about Somalia is also a very big subject and cannot be covered in one session. There are already wealth of education, information, books, papers, and articles, and other documentation is available for those who want to know more about Somalia. My intention here, therefore, is to provide you with a brief overview of Somalia, just so that we can set the stage for our discussion. Just so you know also, I am not an academician, nor am I a professional researcher building models of variables in the economic production function. That I leave it to you, but I want to say that my intention merely is to draw on my experience, in more than 30 years, practical experience, hands-on experience in the area of development economics, and meeting it and seeing it work on the ground, dealing directly with government officials, private sector, individuals and actors, and communities, the so-called beneficiaries of development activities, mainly in Africa, but indeed across the globe. My speech here today also draws on my experience as the current Minister of Finance in Somalia and former Minister of Foreign Affairs. This practical experience, I think, provide me with adequate information to make preliminary conclusions on the current state of affairs in development in the world, and particularly in Somalia. Somalia, as you all know, is an African country located in the Horn of Africa, neighboring Kenya, Ethiopia, and the Republic of Djibouti. It is also among the 17 countries that got independence in 1960. Only 9 countries got independence prior to 1960. Somalia, much like other newly independent countries, it started with a very, very shaky ground, very shaky foundation, just like all the other countries. And you all know what happens when houses and constructions are based on very shaky foundations, and eventual collapse and loss of life and property. That is exactly what took place in 1990s after Somalia failed to reform. Somalia is not a small country either. If it were to be in Europe, with the size of about 640,000 kilometers square, it would be the second largest country in Europe, second only to Russia, and larger than each one of the following countries: Ukraine, France, Spain, Sweden, UK, and others. So it is not a small country either. It also enjoys the longest coastline in mainland Africa at about 3,333 kilometers, which has an abundance of high-quality natural resources, including various fish species. Somalia also has plenty of agricultural land, livestock, and adequate water resources to spearhead an effective poverty alleviation effort if they were managed effectively and very well. Somalia is also known to have oil, gas, and other natural resources, which are currently being actively explored. So contrary to some popular belief, Somalia is actually a very rich place with enormous opportunities, powered by very resilient people, the Somali people, who are just about now waking up to their potential. Somalia, like many other countries, was born with a very poor level of education. Born 1960 with very low education level and skills to run a modern government. Literally, no schools existed in this country before 1940. and very few, mostly focused on primary education when the country got independence in 1960. So without education, what can you possibly do? Can you run a modern government with that kind of level of understanding and skills and government? Number two, borders and community demarcations. Community demarcations that were arbitrarily drawn, communities and families cut into pieces and the one or the other colonial powers, thus leading to constant resource-driven conflict right after independence. That is another very important factor that may have contributed to where Somalia is today. Somalia, therefore, plunged into chaos. Number four, the interest to keep these newly independent countries as markets for goods and services produced by the colonial powers and continued source of raw material. That was another factor that has played a major role in where Somalia today is. And finally, the absence of robust formal education and administrative training to run a country from 1960 on, but also up to that year. The communities remained, therefore, tribal in their aspirations and operations. These are the factors that led to wherever Somalia is today and many other African countries. The effect of this has been that newly born countries with so little tools available to them, like Somalia, could not do much but continue to survive with mere handouts from former colonial powers. These were and continue to be unacceptable and unsustainable. So, if we in Somalia have all these resources, why are we in abject need all the time? This is a question for us all to ponder and find answers for. Academicians and researchers of this world have been telling us for centuries that in the production function, which is the crux of economic development, it is people and their faculties that make the difference in the quality of life a given society can aspire to. We know that, yes, other resources matter. Availability of other resources, land and capital, what have you, matter. But it is people and their skills that make the socio-economic difference, progress possible. Other resources like capital and land need people and the necessary skills to convert them and make them suitable for human use. In a nutshell, therefore, the dreams of all nations and their development depend on their people and the systems that they build. Somalia plunged, therefore, into chaos in 1991 after the fall of the military regime. It had no recognized government for 20 years. Can you imagine a country with its borders, a country with its sovereignty, but no recognized government? I can only imagine that because we have lived through this. 1991 to 2012, there was no recognized government in this country. This period will forever remain a black spot in the history of this country, a period of civil war and mayhem, a period of destruction, decimation of the national treasures, both soft and hard. Physical structures were destroyed to the ground. All national documentations and artifacts were looted, resulting in a total annihilation of national history and memory, with those who were able to flee, scattering across the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the period of debilitating brain drain and a high mortality rate of Somali youth in the high seas. It was in this period that some painful, familiar terms were developed to characterize this country. These characterizations during that 20-year period, and it still continues, include the following. Somalization, when somebody wants to explain something that went wrong, they say Somalization of X and Somalization of that. Somalia was also described as a failed state, the most corrupt country, the most dangerous country in the world, the poorest country on earth, the fragile state, the highly indebted country, the country with pirates, home for terrorists, civil wars, and so on. These were bad, pejorative terms that have defined Somalia during that period. And some of them still continue. The rain is failed one season, and you saw drought killing livestock and people. You saw the rain has come a bit more than usual, and you saw floods killing people at the same time. So always bad news from this country. There was always a plight and disturbing news coming from Somalia. 60 years on, and it continued for a long time. All these need-based factors created a situation in Somalia where only the fittest survived for a long period of time. For many people, it was either succumb to the hopeless fate or risk your life and flee to other countries as refugees, including to Sweden, where a large diaspora, large and now prosperous diaspora live together alongside other countries in the world. In Somalia, we decided to create, recently, we decided to create a third option that we think is viable and doable after 2 decades of suffering, that of restructuring our way of doing business. We simply could not go on like that any longer. Enough was enough. The international community finally, in 20 years, recognized the Somali